Today, citizens living in Catoosa County, Georgia, hear and use Native American words in their daily conversation, whether it be references to cities, mountains, or rivers. In fact, the word Catoosa is a lasting tribute to the Cherokees and translates as up into the hills in the Cherokee language. But do the people of this area today truly understand the history of the land and the people who fought and died to preserve their way of living?
Before we can talk about how the Native Americans got in Catoosa, we got to figure out how did they even get on this continent. About 69,000 years ago, a great ice age hit the world. The water level went down, they believe, as much as 350 to 400 feet. Now this left about a 1,000-mile wide piece of land connecting North America with Asia. Well, a group of people we call East Asians or Mongols began to come up out of China, Mongolia. Over a period of several thousand years, they began to cross into North America, again using the waters that had gone down. It was very easy traveling to go along the edge of what would be our coastline today. And eventually, they spread all across the American continent all the way as far down as Chile. Then eventually that ice began to melt, the waters came back up, and the path was cut off.
Evidence of Native Americans living in the Catoosa County area can further be established at Russell Cave. Located about 60 miles from Catoosa in Bridgeport, Alabama, Russell Cave provides clues to the daily life of early North American inhabitants from 6,500 BC to 1650 AD. The cave shelter archaeological site contains the most complete record of prehistoric cultures in the southeast.
At approximately 1000 BC, we know that the Native Americans had the bow and arrow. They began to make pottery. They improved on their arrowheads. They began to live in larger groups. And in the Tennessee Valley, the Chickamauga Basin, the Mississippi River Basin, and in the Ohio Basin, they began to make burial mounds. And we call them the mound builders.
The Indians here were the ancestors of the current day Muskogee Creeks, which most of those people are out in Oklahoma. We also have smaller bands in places like southern Alabama. And when you look at the mounds today, you see just how awesome this must have happened, with people actually carrying dirt in little baskets up to the mound, and then somebody on the mound actually packing down the dirt. How long this would have taken, because they had no ox carts, they had no wheelbarrows, they carried the dirt in actual baskets, and they had to dig up the dirt with just sticks and shells. Of course, these mounds did not get here all at one time. We do know that the mounds over a process of hundreds of years were built, and especially Mound A here, where the chief lived on top with his family and servants.
The chief would live on top of this mound, and that would be where his home was. And if he spoke to the Creek people, he would speak to them from there.
People who worshiped the sun were the people of Etowah, and they believed the chief was just the intermediary between them and the sun God himself. Imagine a chief standing on top of Mound A, addressing his people in the plaza below, wearing the regalia of a chief, the copper, the bright red feather headdresses, tattoos all over his body, dressed very finely so that the people down below would say, "Oh, he must be a god." Now there are other mounds here on the site. The Mound B, right next to Mound A, is the home of the secondary chief. There was a large council house just to the west of Mound B. Possibly the secondary chief carried on the everyday politics of the town with the elders and people influential in Etowah itself. There's also Mound C right behind Mound A, which was the burial mound for the elite. And as many as 388 bodies were found in Mound C, have been removed by archaeologists.
As a person died, they would start and they would partially bury this person. And then the next one would be buried on top of him, and they would continue to cover it with earth until finally they had a burial mound. Now, some of them have been as high as 40 and 60 feet.
It was part of the religion of these people that if they died, they would take their belongings with them into the afterlife to help them in the afterlife. Some people even think that this advanced civilization here at Etowah as well as other mound sites, could have evolved from Mexico with the Mayans and the Aztecs. The artwork even resembles a lot of what you find down in Mexico, especially you look at the effigies, the statuaries, and so forth. Kind of give you a glimpse of what could have been the civilization that gave rise to the people here. Here they would use crude tools. They'd use fire to build dugout canoes. The dugouts were not canoes, they were dugouts, and they used the firing process to actually scoop out the charcoal from logs, and of course their main mode of transportation was the dugout. The houses here, which we were actually reconstructing a house that was here at Etowah, was built from basically saplings, river cane, clay, and grass. The Creeks, the people of Etowah, grew crops. The soil here was ideal. One reason why they were located in these valleys is because the Etowah River flooded about every year or two and deposited this very rich soil from the mountains onto the plain, and that soil was so rich you didn't even need fertilizer. And so the Three Sisters, still called the Three Sisters by the Muskogee Creeks, was corn, pole beans, and squash or pumpkins. And they called the Three Sisters because the corn stalks provided support for the pole bean vine, and then the leaves of the corn actually shaded the squash, which needed some shading to keep moist during the hot summer months. But they were big meat eaters. The men would go on the great hunts, and close by here was the Appalachian Mountains with bear, deer, all sorts of game that they hunted. The river here provided as much as 15% of their diet, abundant in fish, as well as animals associated with the river itself. If you look at our fish trap in the river, it's right in the Etowah River, right below the mounds here. And the trap shaped like a V. It channeled the fish down this rock wall with the currents, where Indians at the end of the V, where there was an opening, would put this cane trap shaped like a big giant ice cream cone. They would insert that into the point of the V-shaped wall, and fish would swim right into it. Surprisingly, there's still 40 of these in the Etowah River.
One of the biggest turning points for the Native Americans came in 1540, when the Spanish explorer and conquistador Hernando de Soto was sent by the Spanish government to search for gold and a passage to China. He brought with him over 620 men and 220 horses, and pursued his mission over what is known today as the southeastern United States. Reports have stated he was in the Etowah area in August of 1540 and stayed about a week.
They must have been an incredible sight for these people to see. De Soto was in search of gold and silver and riches, which he was never able to find in the southeast, but he brought with him about 8 chroniclers, and these chroniclers would write down everything that they saw and everything that happened here. We know that De Soto actually used his Muskogee interpreter when he was in eastern Tennessee, all the way down into the eastern Tennessee, into Georgia.
Once De Soto came into this area, everything changed for the Native Americans. That means the Europeans were coming. And the first thing that De Soto gave to the Native Americans was smallpox and other diseases. And these diseases continued to plague the Native Americans. Everything changed for the Creek people. At this time, they started using metal. They started buying guns. They began to lose their old ways. They ceased building the temple mounds. They even quit using the bow and arrow for some point. And of course, eventually the English came in, the French came in, and the Spanish came in. The English wanted to cultivate the land. They wanted to possess the land, increase the British Empire, and that's what they did.
The Creeks were in constant contact with the English, first with traders who wanted goods, and then with settlers who wanted land. It was an association the Creeks would come to regret. In extreme northeast Georgia, the Creek nemesis, the Cherokee, began moving west in the mid-1400s. But this move was gradual until increased pressure from coastal settlers forced them further inland in the 1600s. Tensions increased, and by the 1700s, many battles ensued between the two tribes.
The Cherokees, when they came into the Appalachian Mountain area, had eventually moved over into the Tennessee River valleys, and some of their towns were there as well as into the mountains of present-day North Carolina. They had lower town settlements in upper South Carolina, and a part of that flowed into northeast Georgia. Now, during the 1700s, there were a series of Creek-Cherokee conflicts for territory that ended in the Cherokee actually pushing the Creek further and further out. At any time after 1755, then in northern Georgia, the Creeks had pulled out of their towns, and so Cherokees started going into the old fields that were abandoned and making village sites along the rivers that lay in North Georgia.
I really enjoyed history all the way back to when I was 10 years old. I studied history and have always been a historian, and I always thought the Cherokees were the native peoples here. Well, I hate to disappoint you, but Cherokees were like immigrants. They moved into this area down the Appalachians from areas up north in New York and Canada, and they didn't arrive in this area until sometime around 1700. They saw these mounds, and they had no idea who had built them. They thought it was some kind of a sacred site, but they did not know that the peoples before them, the Muskogee Creeks, who we call Muskogee Creeks today, were the builders of these mounds. And so when the first white man came into this area, the Cherokees brought them here to the Etowah site, which had been grown up, had been abandoned many, many years before. And the white men asked, "Did you build these mounds?" And they said, "No, it was somebody that came before us."
Disregarding the traditional clan system of ruling their tribe, the Cherokee began forming their own government with the creation of a council in 1819. They began holding their annual meetings at Newtown, a small community located at the headwaters of the Oostenaula River. Having completed the establishment of a tribal council, they began to consolidate their power with the passage of a number of nationalistic laws. In addition to a law forbidding the sale of land to settlers, they created a bureaucracy similar to the United States of America. On November 12, 1825, the council adopted a resolution making Newtown the Cherokee Nation's capital, renaming it New Echota, in honor of Chota, one of their earlier principal towns. They wanted to prove to the United States government that they could be just as educated and just as civilized as they were, just as they had agreed to in the Treaty of Holston in 1791.
They organized their council house very much like our Congress, House and Senate. The Cherokees had a Cherokee committee upstairs. The National Committee could create the laws. The National Council downstairs would actually vote on the laws. They also had a Supreme Court here. The Cherokees had 8 districts like we have 50 states. And the representatives would come here in October, November of each year, and this is where they created their laws at. And finally, their Constitution in 1827. The Supreme Courthouse is made up of 2 floors also. The offices would have been upstairs. Downstairs is where they would have actually had their Supreme Court meetings at. You would have had 3 Supreme Court judges that would have sat there, and they would have resided over the different court cases that came in. Most of it was tax evasion. The building also there was used for a school and also for a church. The Worcester House was actually built in 1828, and Samuel Worcester was a missionary that came down from Vermont. He actually was learning the Cherokee syllabary, and he was taking and writing the New Testament, copying it over into the Cherokee language so he could teach the Cherokees the Bible in their own language. We also have the print shop. It is a replica of what the building would have looked like, but this was the very first place where they published the very first Native American newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. And it was published February 21st, 1828. And it was bilingual, written in Cherokee and in English. The publication would be about 300 copies a week, and they would be mailed out to all over the United States, and even some of the copies even went to Europe.
A key component in the advancement of the Cherokee Nation was the invention of the alphabet or syllabary of the Cherokee language. This was developed by George Guess, or better known as Sequoyah, starting in 1809. Using a phonetic system where each sound made in speech was represented by a symbol, he created the talking leaves, the 85 letters that make up the Cherokee alphabet.
They say it took him 12 years to create that language. His wife burned his papers after 10 years because she thought he was being lazy. Nobody believed that a Cherokee could create a written language. Only the white people could write on paper, not the Cherokees. They often speak of Sequoyah as being illiterate, that he didn't read and write very well in English. He could write his name, George Guess. For him to create that language is just really amazing. He based the symbols on some of the English letters, Arabic letters, different things, and he had his own symbols for even some of the letters. And it's based on sounds. It's actually based on their syllabary. We call it an alphabet, but it's really a syllabary.
One of the most important and influential people in the Cherokee Nation at this time was Chief John Ross. He was the first and only elected chief of the Cherokee Nation from the time it was formed until his death in 1866. Early in his life, he worked as a federal postmaster from his house, located at the southern end of Missionary Ridge on the old Federal Road, now Rossville, Georgia. The town John Ross founded as Rossville Landing was later renamed Chattanooga, Tennessee, after the Cherokee removal on the Trail of Tears.
John Ross was principal chief of the Cherokees for 38 years. He was only 1/8 Cherokee in our eyes, but the Cherokees counted him as a full-blood because he was Cherokee on his mother's side of the family.
Over the first 10 years of his rule, he fought the white man not with weapons, but with words. As the encroachment of the settlers grew, he turned to the press to make his case. When the land lottery of 1832 divided the Cherokee lands among the whites, he filed suit in the white man's court and won, only to see the ruling go unenforced.
He was a great leader, and he went through a lot of trouble to try to save his people and keep his people here. He was totally against the Cherokees being removed because they were living so much like the white people. He really felt like maybe later on this could actually become a state. It would be a Cherokee state.
Another prominent Cherokee leader of particular importance to Catoosa County was Chief Richard Taylor. He was born in 1788 at Southwest Point in Tennessee at the Cherokee Indian Agency. His father, Thomas Fox Taylor, was a major in the British Army. His Cherokee lineage comes from his mother's side. He was the great-grandson of Nancy Ward, the beloved woman of the Cherokee, who held great power among them. The town of Ringgold, Georgia, in Catoosa County was once called Taylor's Crossroads and was named for Richard Taylor. Taylor's Ridge was named for him as well. He was Catoosa County's first entrepreneur and owned an inn and tavern on the old Federal Road, where he also operated a toll gate, a mill, and a plantation.
Richard was very educated. He could speak English, he could write and read English, and so he became the interpreter from 1808 to 1823 for the Cherokee Indian Agency. So he was a government employee as well as working for Cherokee Nation. In 1822, Richard became a member of the Cherokee National Committee, which answered to the Cherokee National Council, and they took care of the everyday business of the council. He represented his district, which was the Chickamauga district, and he served in that capacity off and on for many years. Now, in 1830, at the time of the removal issue, when they were trying to stop it in Washington, D.C., he was appointed to attend the sessions in Congress, and he, along with John Ross and several other members of Cherokee Nation, were taken around town by Davy Crockett, and they were trying to drum up support among the senators and the representatives against the Removal Act. Well, as we know, the Cherokee Removal Act was pushed through, and they even tried meeting with Andrew Jackson, the person that they had fought with. And Andrew Jackson shook every one of these people's hands. But when he got to Richard Taylor, who was very last in line, he held his hand and he would not let go of it. And Jackson just held on to his hand and was professing friendship. And he was saying, you know, you need to remove. That's the only way. You have to remove. And I cannot interfere with the laws of Georgia.
Where we're setting at today is what we call a middle-class Cherokee homestead. And by the time the Cherokees were living here in the 1820s and 1830s, they were living very much like the white people. But before that time period, they were a matrilineal society. The women actually ruled the homesteads. When a Cherokee man married a Cherokee woman, he would move into her house. When the children were born, they would take on the clan names of the mother's side of the family. By this time period, they were wearing dresses, calico dresses, just like the white people were wearing. Three main vegetables that they had: corn, beans, and squash. And you'd be surprised, with the corn being so much here, they had enough to trade it, sell it, and keep enough to eat in the wintertime.
The fields, the crops would have been nearby, which originally the women would have tended, but over time the men came to where they were doing a little more of the agricultural work also. When they became more dependent on the farms, they also hunted to supplement their food supply, but their agricultural crops became more important to them over the years.
The Cherokees never had headdresses, and they never had teepees. They had what we call wattle and daub houses made out of sticks and clay, very similar to the Iroquois longhouses. And by this time period, they were living in cabins, and some of them were actually living in houses. Elias Boutnot was living in a house. John Ross was living in a house, of course. And Chief Van has probably one of the nicest houses you'll see. It's actually a plantation house. Chief Van was the richest of the Cherokees. There's just no doubt about that. He had 110 slaves. He farmed 800 acres of land.
The Cherokee Nation had nearly completed a maturation process which began 30 years before. New Echota stood as the capital of a nation with its own language, its own newspaper, a bicameral legislation, and a republican form of government. The Cherokee Nation also celebrated its own arts and sports. Key players in the Cherokee Nation government were Elias Boutnot, his brother Stand Watie, his uncle Major Ridge, and his cousin John Ridge. They, along with John Ross, Charles R. Hicks, and his son Elijah Hicks, formed the ruling elite of the Cherokee Nation, which came to believe that rapid acculturation was critical to the survival of the Cherokee Nation. The United States, particularly the state of Georgia, despite professed aims of civilizing the Cherokee by moving them west, were only interested in the land the Cherokee occupied. White settlers began encroaching on the Cherokee lands through violence and legal actions such as the Georgia Land Lottery. The Cherokees' defense of their land came to a climax in two Supreme Court cases, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia. Although the Supreme Court acknowledged the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation, President Andrew Jackson refused to take action that would force Georgia to abide by the court's rulings.
The famous case Worcester versus Georgia that said simply Georgia did not have a right to place laws over these Cherokee people. But Andrew Jackson refused to acknowledge that, refused to enforce it. And so by doing that, Georgia actually sent people up here in 1832 to measure the land off the surveyors, and they divided it up into 40-acre lots where they thought the gold was, and 160-acre lots for farmland. And they had a land lottery in 1832. The Georgians wanted this land because everything was being pushed out west. The Cherokees were still here. They wanted to remove so they could have this land. And you have to realize this was vast, great farmland. And it had already been cleared off because these Cherokees had already been living like the white people. They had a land that was already settled. All they had to do was move right into it.
A lot of people in this area don't really understand the full significance of Red Clay. They think, well, it's just a local state park. But actually, it has a fascinating history. It was actually the last council grounds of the Cherokee Nation immediately prior to the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee Nation had been established with their government at New Echota, which is at Calhoun, Georgia. But then the state of Georgia actually passed a law that said that the Cherokees could not meet anywhere in that state unless it was to negotiate or sign a treaty to give up the Cherokees' land in the state of Georgia. So the Cherokees were faced with quite a problem. They really didn't want to give up more of their land than they already had. Through many treaties over the years, the Cherokee Nation had shrunk to where it was just a shadow of its original size. So the Cherokees were trying to find a peaceful solution to being forced off of more of their land. So in order to avoid breaking the law in Georgia, they started coming here to Red Clay, which actually is in Tennessee. They actually had 11 council meetings here between 1832 and 1837. In 1835, of course, Major Ridge and his followers, who had become convinced that the Cherokees' only hope for survival as a separate nation and have their own sovereign government was to agree to go west.
Probably the other most famous site here at New Echota is the Boot Knot site. Right there on December 29th, 1835, no less than 200 Cherokees met here, and 20 of them would later sign the treaty that we know as the Treaty of New Echota, saying that the Cherokees would leave here.
And it was done without the knowledge of the government of the Cherokee Nation. So, in effect, the treaty was illegal. The Supreme Court supported the Cherokee in having a right to retain their own lands, having the right to not be forced off of their land without their permission, without their agreement. But because the government of the United States had the might to enforce its will, in 1837, federal troops came in and started rounding up the Cherokees in preparation for what was known as the Trail of Tears.
The reason they signed it, I have to believe, is the fact that they were outnumbered here at least 6-1, and they didn't have a chance. Georgia had already had the land lottery in 1832, and the settlers were already coming in this area, and they believed that they were saving their people by moving them. They had no idea the Trail of Tears was going to happen. But they do say that Major Ridge replied that night when he stepped off the porch. He said, "I have signed my own death warrant." And I believe he knew what was going to happen. But he believed he was saving his people by moving them.
In 1835, when John Ross was residing in Tennessee, because he needed to get away from the harshness of the Georgians, he was arrested in his home by the Georgia Guard, who came across the state line between Georgia and Tennessee. They came out of their jurisdiction, arrested him. Also at his home at the same time of this arrest was John Howard Payne. And John Howard Payne was a white man, but he had been commissioned by John Ross to gather material and information about the history and the culture of the Cherokee and write it down before a lot of it was lost. So here John Ross is and John Howard Payne being arrested by the Georgia Guard and then taken across the Tennessee-Georgia state line back into Georgia. There they were made prisoners in the Van House. John Ross and John Howard Payne both were held there without being explained why they were arrested, but just held captive. There was a reason for this. The federal government did not want John Ross to be with his people, while Schermerhorn and the Treaty Party, who were the Cherokee, then began work on signing the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. So John was held captive and could not be there at the meetings.
In one of the most tragic episodes of our history, innocent men, women, and children were taken from their homes, put into stockades, and forced to march 1,000 miles west. This journey is known today as the Trail of Tears.
When they first rounded them up, they put them in the stockades, but a lot of times they didn't stay in the stockades very long, maybe 1 or 2 weeks, and then they would be put in internment camps. And there were 4 major points for the internment camps. One of them was Fort Payne, Alabama, Ross's Landing, and then there were 2 in Charleston, Tennessee. And that's actually where they leave out on the Trail of Tears. According to Winfield Scott's records, the general at that time that was over the removal, he was saying that they rounded up all the Cherokees in 21 days. Now that's all the ones in Georgia that we know of. But still, that's 16,000 people at least.
John Ross lost a lot in the removal. Of course, he lost all of his property. He did retain his title as chief. But his wife, Quady, she died along the Trail of Tears and is buried in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the story goes that there was a child, a Cherokee child on the Trail of Tears who was very cold. And so Quady took her wrap off, her coat off, and gave it to the child so the child would not get sick from being out in the cold and being exposed. Quady caught pneumonia and died. The child that she gave her coat to did survive and made it on into Indian Territory.
You have to remember that they were being rounded up in early May of 1838. That's the reason we find a lot of them without blankets, without shoes. Plus, a lot of the Cherokee people felt like if they took things from the Americans that they were agreeing with the treaty, and they were not agreeing with the treaty. So a lot of them didn't take any supplies. You know, there's 4 trails we talk about on Trail of Tears. We mentioned earlier Fort Payne, Alabama. They left out their own boats. Ross's Landing, they left their own boats also. And you have to remember that it was an extremely dry summer that year. And the Cherokees started dying on those boats. So John Ross went back to Washington City and he said, "My people are dying. Can we not wait past the 6th season?" But they didn't leave in September. They waited till October. John Ross was doing his very best to keep his people here. But then again, he didn't know it was going to be an early winter. And the 2 routes that were chosen for them to take in the summertime, they were the 2 routes that they sent them on in the wintertime. By the time they got up to Illinois, trying to cross over the Mississippi River, it was frozen over. A lot of them did not make it until March of 1839. And the Cherokee symbols, west meant death because that's where the sun went down. And when a lot of them were told they were being sent out west, they thought they were being sent to die. A lot of them gave up hope.
After the removal, the John Ross faction blamed Ridge and the other signers of the Treaty of New Echota for the hardships of the removal. In June 1839, Major Ridge, his son John, and his nephew, Elias Boutenot, were assassinated by Cherokees of the Ross faction to remove them as political rivals and to intimidate the political establishment of the old settlers who had moved out west earlier. Tragically, about 4,000 Cherokee people died as a result of the removal, and a nation that had been formed 50 years earlier on the premise that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights painfully closed the curtain on a culture that had done nothing wrong.
The Cherokee Nation out west still fights for their survival in the courts, of course. Chad Smith, principal chief, is a great chief, a great leader for them. He's trying to help them with jobs. The artwork is continuing on. Even today, with the Cherokee Phoenix that's published, part of it's in Cherokee. They're trying not to lose the language. North Carolina, the Eastern Band, they're doing the same thing. They're giving school credit now at the reservation up there at the Qualla boundary for learning Cherokee, so it doesn't become a lost language.
This museum houses the largest collection in the world of contemporary Cherokee art and craft, and is the only museum in the world devoted to the living Cherokee artists. We house 2,000 square feet of exhibits here with more than 1,000 objects on display. We house both Eastern Cherokee and Western Cherokee work, and thus we have put the people back together under one roof as one nation again in the Southeast, not by politics, but by the artisans. And when I say the Eastern and Western Cherokee, I specifically mean the Eastern Band Cherokee here in North Carolina, and in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, Cherokee Nation, and United Catoosa Band, the 3 federally recognized factions of Cherokee. This collection is a testimony to their existence, and it is of great importance. It is their national treasure.
There are thousands and thousands of artifacts. We only have less than probably 2% of the artifacts that were found at Etowah in our collection here in the museum, but we got some of the finest. We have the marble effigies, which are each 125 pounds, and they represent the chief and the chief's wife, the lineage of the Sun family that were here at Etowah. These are amongst the most famous of all Native American artifacts in the country, and they're right here at Etowah's museum. The copper artifacts here are fascinating. Some of the finest copper work you'll find anywhere, indicative of a very highly advanced culture here at Etowah.
One of the significant features that we have here on the park grounds is the eternal flame of the Cherokees. When the Cherokees would have their council meetings, they would always have a council fire. When the council was over, there would be a firekeeper who would tend the coals until they brought them back to relight the next council fire, so that it was a continuous process. It wasn't a completely new fire lit each time.
When the Cherokee people were forced west on the Trail of Tears, some of the Cherokees remained in western North Carolina. The people who were forced west carried with them coals from a council fire to light their own council fire in their new homeland. In 1951, the Eastern Band of Cherokees decided they wanted part of the fire that had been carried to Oklahoma. So, the Cherokee Nation gave permission for part of the fire to be brought to North Carolina to be tended and kept burning there. Over the years, the Cherokees from the Eastern Band and those from the Cherokee Nation started talking about the importance of coming together to maintain relations and to seek solutions for common problems. In 1984, a council reunion was held here on the grounds of Red Clay.
In preparation for that, 10 runners were chosen from the reservation there in North Carolina, and those runners took turns carrying hand-carved torches, which were lit by the fire there in North Carolina, and they were carried here to Red Clay. During the opening ceremonies of that council reunion, the two chiefs, Robert Youngdeer from the Eastern Band and Ross Swimmer from the Cherokee Nation, together took a torch and lit the eternal flame of the Cherokees here on the grounds of Red Clay, because this was the site of their last council meetings before the division of the Cherokee Nation and before the Trail of Tears.
Keeping the Native American traditions, customs, and languages alive and thriving is a challenge to many present-day Native Americans.
Well, the main thing for me, what I look at is, trying to keep the identity. That's the only thing we got left, because we're starting to lose our customs and traditions. And anymore, that's what it's going to take to do these processes, the ceremonies and dances and stuff like that. That's what it takes. You got to have the language. So we try to enhance that, but sometimes people, they're being swayed by other activities, and they don't seem to have any interest in it. But it's hard to get people interested in trying to learn the language, their own language. But outside people seems to me like they have more interest in trying to learn it. But it's hard to hold somebody's interest in trying to teach them, because of new activities, new world, changing of the world, so to speak. So, but that's what it takes to do, is keep our traditions and customs intact.
Everybody in the family would come together and say, "We want you to learn how to do this," and they would sit down, or they was, especially in the Cherokee dancing, they would take you outside and we would practice these dancing. And they would sing songs. You would have to know the songs with the dance. I guess that's one way we learn how to keep it going, by that. I do some programs for schools, third graders up to fifth grade. It's just amazing how it's just their faces are just looking right at you. It's like, wow, he is a Native American. Wow. That really gets you.
Most of the other Cherokee sites in Catoosa is left with their names. Of course, the name Catoosa is one of the few that we have in this particular area. There is a Cherokee burial ground at the foot of what we call Anderson Cemetery today. We believe that Richard Taylor, some of his family was buried there, and it was built over with the Lafayette Road that goes into Ringo.
There would have been mound sites in Catoosa County, for instance. Why don't we see mounds today? Well, many of them have been destroyed. We have, with progress, that starts all the way back to the first coming of the first peoples into this territory, where roads were built through mounds. Pot hunters would go and look in mounds for artifacts. We have shopping centers, we have development, we've had even railroads went right through the middle of mounds. So well over half the mounds have been destroyed, and that's unfortunate.
You know, we talk about sacred sites being intact and preserving sacred sites, or even a human grave. Our way of preserving is the Indian way, and the Muskogee way is that once you bury something, that's it, that's preservation. Once you bury something, you no longer disturb it or anything. But the non-Indian way is that you have to make it look pretty. And which is all right, I guess. But at the same time, it also tends to be tourist attraction in some sacred sites. But it's totally different from the Indian way. That's the difference between preservation from two perspectives.
If we can look at the mistakes that have been made in the past, and yet also look at the good things that were done, like with the Cherokees, where they believed the community had to take care of all of its members, not each person looking after his or her own interests, then we would be so much better off today. We have so many nations against nations just interested in their own benefit, their own gain. We need to think on a more global scale. If we can do that, then we will come much closer to what the Cherokees traditionally believed in.
Well, in our American history, you cannot study one aspect, one time period, without Native American history being involved. And so they helped to shape the way that this nation was built. And on top of that, their cultures, their values, their arts, their crafts that they still produce today, their languages, they're all very rich and important to this country's history. And we should be very proud and honored that we still have Cherokees here today that we can look to and remember, and they're still contributing. They're not gone. They're still here.
Being a Native American is for, I guess, for this country to show that we were the first ones here, and we're still here.
In my history textbook in high school, I read that the mound builders were some race of man. They certainly weren't Indians, which is sad. It shows that our attitude toward the Native Americans was absolutely wrong, and we had no idea that a great civilization capable of producing such fine artifacts that you see in our museum and have such a sophisticated political existence was ever here, and it was. And it's something we should be proud of.
Most of the people have no idea of the heritage and how long that people lived in the Catoosa area and how great a people they were and what a fantastic civilization that they had before the time that the Europeans came here. I believe that we need to have more respect for the Native American people that were here and realize that we are the newcomers. They've been here for a long time, and I believe we can learn a lot from them.